The morning he disappeared, the silence felt louder than anything Margaret Doyle had ever known. At 70, she stood in her kitchen, staring at the untouched cup of tea across from her, the one she had poured out of habit after 44 years of marriage. Her husband, Arthur Doyle, had always been a man of routine, quiet, predictable, present in a way that felt constant, even if it was never warm. So at first, she didn't panic. She called his name once, expecting the usual delay, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the quiet clearing of his throat before he took his seat. But nothing came. Margaret walked toward the bedroom slowly, her movements steady, not yet afraid. But the moment she opened the door, something inside her shifted. His side of the bed was untouched, the blanket folded back neatly, as if he had risen carefully, deliberately, making sure not to disturb anything. The closet told the rest of the story. Gaps where shirts used to hang, the old coat missing, the small suitcase that hadn't been moved in years. Gone. No note, no message, no explanation. Only the quiet precision of someone who had planned to leave without being seen. Margaret stood there, her hands still at her sides, her thoughts strangely calm. Because what unsettled her most wasn't that he was gone. It was the realization that after all those years, she had never truly known the man she had spent her life beside. At first, Margaret Doyle tried to treat it like one of Arthur's usual silences. For years, he had drifted in and out of conversations, disappearing into himself for hours, sometimes days, without explanation. It had never been loud enough to question, never disruptive enough to confront. Just the way he was. So she waited. She moved through the house the same way she always had, preparing meals out of habit, pausing at familiar moments as if he might still return to fill them. The ticking clock grew louder. The empty chair across the table felt heavier. But something inside her resisted calling it what it truly was, because to admit he was gone meant admitting she didn't understand why. By the second day, the absence began to take shape. Neighbors stopped by, their concern wrapped in quiet curiosity. "Have you heard from him?" they asked, their eyes searching her face for something more dramatic than the calm she offered. Margaret answered simply. No argument, no warning, no reason. And the simplicity of that truth made it harder for anyone to accept. By the third day, the police arrived, polite, professional, distant. They asked the expected questions. Had they argued? Was there financial trouble? Did he have somewhere else to go? Margaret answered each one the same way. No, no, no. And then came the question that lingered longer than the rest. Did you know him well? For the first time, she hesitated, not because she wanted to hide anything, but because she didn't know the answer. That realization settled slowly, pressing down on 44 years of shared space, shared routines, shared silence. A marriage that had looked stable from the outside suddenly felt incomplete. After the officers left, the house seemed different, larger, emptier. Not because Arthur had filled it with presence, but because his absence revealed just how much had always been missing. And as the evening stretched into another quiet night, Margaret sat alone, her thoughts unusually clear. He hadn't just disappeared overnight. In a way, he had been leaving for years. By the fourth day, the waiting had begun to change, not into panic, but into something quieter and far more unsettling. Margaret Doyle no longer expected the sound of Arthur returning. Instead, she found herself noticing things she had overlooked for years, small details that now felt deliberate. The locked drawers in his study, the long walks he used to take without explanation, the way he listened more than he spoke, as if storing pieces of the world somewhere she could never reach. At the time, none of it had seemed important. Now it felt intentional. She moved slowly through the house, her eyes tracing objects that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if they belonged to a version of her life she had never been invited to fully understand. Even her own reflection in the hallway mirror seemed distant, like she was looking at someone who had been living beside a stranger without realizing it. By the end of the week, the house had settled into something she couldn't quite name. Not grief, not fear, something closer to recognition. That the life she believed she understood had always contained gaps, spaces she had filled with assumption instead of truth. And then, just as that realization began to take hold, the phone rang. The sound cut sharply through the silence, unexpected and immediate. Margaret hesitated only a moment before answering, her hand steady despite the tension rising in her chest. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, calm, professional, a man introducing himself as a lawyer. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "I'm calling regarding a property registered under your husband's name." Margaret frowned slightly. "A property?" There was a pause. "Yes," the man replied. "One we believe you may not be aware of." And in that moment, standing alone in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to a past she didn't fully understand, something inside Margaret shifted. Because whatever Arthur had taken with him when he left, he had also left something behind, something hidden, something waiting to be found. And for the first time since his disappearance, she realized the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The address didn't feel real. It sat in Margaret Doyle's hand like something that belonged to another life, one she had never been part of. She read it more than once, as if repetition might make it familiar. But it didn't. She had never been there, had never heard of it. And yet, it was tied to her husband. The drive took her farther than she expected. With every mile, the world she recognized seemed to fade, quiet streets replaced by long stretches of empty road, then open land, then a silence that felt almost deliberate. It was the kind of place people didn't pass through by accident. They came here on purpose. Margaret tightened her grip on the steering wheel, not out of fear, but because something about this felt important, like she was being led towards something she hadn't been meant to see until now. When the house finally appeared, she didn't stop right away. She slowed, watched it from a distance, because this wasn't what she had imagined. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't falling apart. It was cared for. The paint was fresh. The windows were clean. The garden trimmed with a quiet precision that spoke of routine, not neglect. Someone had been here. Recently. Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, the air around her heavier somehow, as if the place itself held its breath. Each step toward the front door carried a weight she couldn't fully explain. Not fear, not hesitation, but something closer to recognition. Like approaching a truth she had always sensed but never faced. The key had been given to her by the lawyer. Small, ordinary. But now it felt like more than that. She paused at the door for only a second before sliding it into the lock and turning it. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Final. The door creaked open, and the first thing Margaret felt wasn't confusion. It was something else. Because the house didn't feel empty. It felt paused, like someone had just stepped out and might return at any moment. And in that moment, one truth settled quietly inside her. This wasn't just a property her husband had owned. This was a life he had never shared. Margaret stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind her with a care that felt almost instinctive. The air didn't carry the stale stillness of an abandoned place. It felt lived in, not recently, but deliberately. Margaret Doyle moved through the house in silence, her eyes tracing every detail. A chair sat slightly angled near the window, as if someone had just stood up from it. A book lay open on a small table, its pages paused mid-thought. A cup rested beside it, empty, but not forgotten. Nothing was out of place. And yet, nothing belonged to the life she remembered. Each room revealed the same quiet precision. Not staged, not decorative, just intentional, as if this space had been built not to impress, but to hold something real. Margaret's chest tightened, because the more she looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an extension of their home. It was separate, a life that had run parallel to hers, unseen, unspoken. And then she saw them, the photographs, arranged carefully along a narrow shelf, each one framed with the same understated care. At first they didn't make sense, because they weren't of strangers. They were of her. Margaret stepped closer, her breath catching as she studied them one by one. There she was, years younger, standing in her own kitchen, laughing in a way she hadn't in decades, sitting by the window, reading, unaware of the camera, walking through the garden, lost in thought. Moments she didn't remember being captured, moments she didn't remember feeling that way. Her fingers hovered over one of the frames, but she didn't touch it, because something inside her had already begun to understand. He had been watching, not in a way that felt threatening, but in a way that felt distant, observing, preserving. Margaret stepped back slowly, her thoughts struggling to connect the man she had lived beside with the one who had created this place. Because the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Her husband hadn't just left. He had been living another version of their life, all along. Drawn by something she couldn't quite explain, Margaret Doyle moved deeper into the house, her steps quieter now, more careful, as if she were entering a space that demanded attention. At the far end of a smaller room, she found it, a wooden desk, simple, worn, but carefully maintained. On top of it sat a stack of letters, dozens of them, each one dated, each one written in Arthur's familiar handwriting, the same careful script she had seen for years on notes and lists. And yet, none of them had ever been sent. The envelopes were blank, no addresses, no stamps, as if they had never been meant to leave this room. Margaret sat down slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the first letter. The paper felt fragile, worn at the edges, but preserved with a kind of quiet care that made her pause. Then she unfolded it, and as her eyes moved across the page, something inside her shifted. This wasn't the man she had known, or perhaps not the man she had been allowed to know. The words were hesitant at first, uncertain, as if he had been learning how to speak all over again. Sentences stopped and restarted, thoughts circled back before moving forward. But even in those early lines, there was something unmistakable, effort, a quiet reaching. As if he had been trying again and again to say something he never found the courage to say out loud. Margaret picked up another letter, and then another. Time slipped past unnoticed as she read, each page pulling her deeper into a voice she had never heard in 44 years of marriage. A voice that didn't belong to silence, a voice that had always been there, just hidden. And as the pattern began to unfold, one truth became clear. These weren't just letters. They were a conversation he had been having with her for decades, without ever speaking a word. At first, the letters felt distant, like fragments of a voice still learning how to be heard. But as Margaret Doyle continued reading, something began to shift. The hesitation faded. The words grew steadier, more deliberate. What had started as uncertain thoughts slowly became something undeniable. A confession stretched across decades. He wrote about ordinary days, moments she barely remembered. A morning when she laughed softly in the kitchen, an afternoon spent by the window with a book in her lap, evenings where nothing seemed to happen at all. And yet, in his words, those moments felt significant, preserved, as if he had been holding on to pieces of their life she had unknowingly let slip away. Margaret's chest tightened as she turned each page, her breathing slower now, more measured, because the tone had begun to change. At first it was subtle, then impossible to ignore. Regret, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, persistent, woven into nearly every line. "I don't think I ever learned how to be close to you," one letter read, the ink slightly smudged, as if he had paused too long before continuing. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to stay once I got there." Margaret's fingers trembled against the paper, because for the first time in 44 years, she was seeing something she had always felt, but never fully understood. The distance between them, not caused by anger, not betrayal, but something quieter, something harder to name. Fear, uncertainty, a lack of knowing how to connect, even when the desire was there. Letter after letter, the pattern unfolded. Not a single moment that broke them, but a lifetime of moments left incomplete. Words unsaid, feelings unexpressed, opportunities missed, not out of indifference, but out of not knowing how to take them. And that realization hurt more than anything else, because it meant he had been there all along, trying, failing, and trying again in silence. And as Margaret lowered the final page, the room felt different, not emptier, but heavier, because the man she thought she had lost had never truly been gone. He had just been unheard. By the time Margaret Doyle reached the final letter, the light in the room had begun to fade. The soft glow of afternoon slipped quietly into dusk, and she hadn't even noticed how long she had been sitting there. Time no longer felt important. Only the words in her hands did. She paused before opening the last page, not out of fear, but because something inside her already knew this one would be different. And it was. The handwriting was steadier, clearer, as if, after years of searching, he had finally found the words he had never been able to say out loud. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I've done the one thing I was always afraid to do: leave without knowing if I ever truly stayed." Margaret's breath caught. She read slowly now, each word settling deeper than the last. He wrote about the house, the letters, the photographs, not as replacements for their life, but because of it. A place where he could face the parts of himself he never knew how to express in front of her. A place where he could say what had always felt too difficult to speak. Not because he didn't feel those things, but because he didn't know how to carry them into the space they shared. He wrote about choosing to stay again and again, even when it would have been easier to walk away. About loving her, not loudly, not visibly, but persistently. In the only way he understood, flawed, incomplete, but real. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reached the final lines. "I don't expect you to forgive what I couldn't give you, but I hope you'll see that I never stopped trying to find a way to give it." The room fell completely still, and for the first time since the morning he disappeared, the question that had followed her, why, no longer felt as heavy. Not because she had every answer, but because she had enough. And as she folded the letter carefully and placed it back where it belonged, something inside her shifted. Not closure, not peace, but something steadier. Acceptance, because the man she had lived beside for 44 years had not been empty, only silent in a language she had only just begun to understand. Margaret didn't take the letters with her. That decision came quietly, but with absolute clarity. Standing in the stillness of the room, surrounded by a life she had never been invited to fully see, Margaret Doyle understood something she hadn't expected. These words didn't belong to her. Not in the way she once believed everything in their shared life did. They belonged to this place, to the version of Arthur Doyle that had existed here, unspoken, unfinished, but finally understood. She gathered nothing, no photographs, no letters, no proof, because for the first time she realized she didn't need to carry them to understand their meaning. Some truths weren't meant to be taken, only seen, only felt, only accepted. Margaret walked slowly back through the house, her eyes tracing each detail one last time. The chair by the window, the open book, the quiet order that had once unsettled her now felt complete, not comforting, but no longer confusing. When she stepped outside, the evening air met her gently, cooler now, softer. She turned back for a brief moment, looking at the house, not as a place of mystery anymore, but as a place of clarity. Then she closed the door, carefully, deliberately, as if sealing something that had finally been allowed to exist. The drive back felt different. The same road, the same distance, but something inside her had shifted. She didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was carrying something forward, understanding. Not of everything, but enough. Because the question that had followed her since the morning he disappeared, why did he leave, no longer held the same weight. Now she saw it differently. He hadn't left to escape. He had left to finally step into the only place where he knew how to be fully himself. And in doing so, he had left her with something far more lasting than answers. He had left her with the truth. Days later, Margaret Doyle returned to her home, but it no longer felt like the same place she had left behind. The silence was still there, but it had changed. It no longer pressed against her like something empty or unresolved. Instead, it felt understood, as if the quiet that had once separated them now carried meaning she had only just learned to recognize. She moved through each room slowly, her gaze lingering on the smallest details. The chair where Arthur used to sit, the space at the table where his presence had always felt more routine than real. For years, she had lived beside that silence without knowing what it meant. Now she did. And strangely, that knowledge softened something inside her. Margaret didn't try to recreate what they had lost. She didn't search for more answers. She didn't return to the hidden house, because she understood something important now, that what she had found there wasn't meant to be carried back into this life. It was meant to be seen, and then left where it belonged. She poured herself a cup of tea, the same quiet habit she had kept for decades. But this time, she didn't place a second cup across from her, not out of loneliness, but out of acceptance. Because for the first time in 44 years, she wasn't waiting for someone to fill the space beside her. She was simply sitting within it, present, whole. and as the light shifted gently through the window, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Not closure, not happiness, but something steadier than both, peace. Not perfect, not complete, but real. Because she no longer measured her life by what had been missing. She understood now that even in silence, there had been something there all along. She had just never known how to hear it. In the quiet that followed, Margaret Doyle no longer felt like a woman left behind. She felt like someone who had finally understood. Days passed, then weeks, and the life she returned to no longer felt incomplete. The silence that once echoed with absence now carried something softer, something she could finally recognize. Not emptiness, but meaning. She no longer replayed the morning he disappeared. She no longer searched for answers that didn't exist, because what she had found in that hidden house was enough. Not perfect, not simple, but real. Margaret began to see her past differently, not as years lost to distance, but as a life shaped by a kind of love she hadn't known how to see. A love that didn't speak loudly, didn't show itself clearly, but had been there, in its own quiet, imperfect way. And now, for the first time, she wasn't trying to fill the silence. She was living within it. Calm, steady, whole. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is this: not everyone knows how to love the way we need them to, and that silence can feel like absence, like distance, like something missing. But what if it's not? What if some people love quietly, deeply, in ways they never learned how to show? Understanding that doesn't erase the pain, but it changes the meaning. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments. Have you ever realized someone loved you only after you truly understood them? And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the next story you hear might help you see your own life in a completely new way.